I think it just made me, it just become like less selfish. And I don't want to quite say it's selfish, but you're not making any sacrifices for anything, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're not making any sacrifices for anything, you're probably not building anything meaningful.
Welcome to the Dad Bod, a podcast that tells the story of what it means to be a dad today, one dad at a time. My name is Sean, and I'm a dad living in New York City with my wife and our 2 young native New Yorkers. The formula for the Dad Bod is simple. Each episode, we're going to interview one dad to get his story of being a dad. Over time, all of these stories will start to create the bigger story of what it means to be a dad today. Thank you very much to everyone for tuning in. If you like what we're doing with the Dad Bod, consider giving it a 5-star review in your favorite podcast app and sharing it with your friends and family, because these meaningful conversations about fatherhood are a great way to have a meaningful conversation of your own with someone that you care about. So the voice you heard at the beginning of the show belongs to my new friend and fellow dad, John. I was introduced to John by Mitch, Generational Wisdom of Dad, further extending the rich branch of the Dad Bod tree that started with Andrew, Dim Sum Dad. John and I met for the interview at his office, the type of space that works very hard just to keep up and yet remain ultimately indistinguishable from the other offices in midtown Manhattan. In this office, I could imagine John and I being introduced for professional reasons. We both work in finance. But instead, we were meeting as 2 dads to talk about fatherhood. In a nod to the professional environment around us, the start of our conversation felt like water cooler small talk. And to be honest, I was worried that John and I would be held back by our shared professional customs and mannerisms that insist on keeping things, well, professional rather than personal. Thankfully, to borrow from St. Augustine, even though we were physically meeting in a building prototypical to the city of man, by the end of our conversation, we would find ourselves seated at a communal table in the city of God. All right, enough talking now. I'm humbled to be sharing this conversation with you. John, City of Dad. What's the latest thing you've ordered for yourself?
A pair of squash sneakers.
Okay. Big squash player?
I am not. I just picked it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
People who play squash seem like really enthusiastic.
It is an easier sport to pick up than tennis because it's a hard sport. It's a very hard sport, very challenging to become good. But unlike tennis, where it's like if you're starting out, you're hitting the ball into the net. It's always going out. You're mishitting it. It's flying all over the place. That happens. You can mishit it, obviously, in squash. But it's just a more confined area.
Right.
And so you can start playing and get going faster than, say, tennis.
Yeah. So how'd you get into that? Picking up a new sport?
Yeah. So my wife and I joined this racket club out in Brooklyn called the Casino.
Got
I
it.
actually played bridge there. I just took a bridge, too.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So I'm biting off a lot.
Yeah, learning new things.
I know, yes.
Another thing that people get really into is bridge.
It is. Bridge is awesome. The game has sort of parameters, but there are conventions of how to play the game.
Okay.
And as those conventions, so the game is always evolving. And these conventions, it's like a language.
Yeah.
And so the way I communicate with my partner about bidding, the conventions change over decades.
Yeah.
I can say something by my bid that's communicating something to you that is part of the code. And so it's like a language. And you communicate with your partner based on, and you're trying to figure out what your partner has.
Okay.
And so you get to a contract, but the bidding is probably 70% of the game.
So introduce yourself. Tell me your name, whether you're married, how long you've been married, how many kids you have, their ages and genders, what you do for a living, as well as any other hats that you wear or commitments that you keep that are worth mentioning.
Okay. My name is John. I grew up in Queens, so not far from here. I now live in Brooklyn, so I'm flying the enemy flag by moving to the a neighboring county.
That's a big one.
I've lived in Manhattan and Brooklyn. I've been married for 7 years, and my kids are 7 and 5, and they're both girls. I've worked for the same firm for almost 20 years. I manage 2 portfolios, and those are the primary business lines for our company.
Okay. And any other hats that you wear outside of work? And
other hats.
Parenting and
parenting. Well, yeah, I mean that's been like pretty demanding. The parenting part has been pretty demanding, as you know. And then my wife and I are involved in a lot of charitable organizations. She serves on a couple of boards. We've sponsored some initiatives at my alma mater around free speech and free expression on campus, and we're involved in a lot of charities around education.
So tell me about growing up in Queens.
It was great. I wish that more communities were like how I grew up, where I walked to my grade school was right down the block. I walked to school. I walked home from school. If I had a basketball game, I would just go home, have, a snack or something after school, walk back to the gym, go to basketball practice. If I had a baseball game, I had a bike. I would ride my bike to the baseball field. And it was a really nice place to grow up. Densely populated, but, people had lawns and so on. It was kind of an idyllic place, and you're 20 minutes from the city.
And so you had this childhood that I think I hear a lot of us long for, and it is often marked by simplicity and freedom of movement as a kid.
I think that's a great way to put it. And, I think now things are so planned, and I wonder about the implications of that, because I'm not saying it's going to be all bad, but I wonder if the kids don't have too much planned for them, and there's not the spontaneity and the fun and the exhilaration and the confidence that comes from like figuring something out on your own.
Yeah. Tell me about your dad.
My dad passed away in late 2023. He was sick for a very short period of time, and he died of cancer. It was actually, in some ways, it was a blessing. He had pancreatic cancer, which progresses asymptomatically, and he just passed very quickly. So he wasn't in a lot of pain, and he passed very quickly. He and my mom separated when I was about 15. And so he had moved out of the New York area when I was a little bit older, my early 20s. So I didn't get to see him as much, as I got older, but we were involved in each other's lives. And very good sense of humor, very hard worker. We talked earlier about, taking risks. He took risks, certainly with his career, started his own company.
What did he do for a living?
Freight forwarding.
Okay.
Which is still a thing, but before FedEx and UPS sort of developed all this technology about like how to, move a piece of freight from the East Coast to the West Coast, say, and all points in between. There were these freight forwarders had relationships with truckers, had relationships with the airlines, had relationships maybe even with like, sea container companies and so on. And they would say, listen, I can get that set of freight to these locations for this amount of money by packaging together, all these like different modes of transit. And so it was very much like a relationship thing. And, you had to have a lot of stuff in your head, right? Automation, barcoding and automation, he had that in his business, but that only became more and more sophisticated, and it became a scale business. His business did very well for a long period of time. He put us all through college. But as he reached about my age, when he got into his 50s, it became harder. I don't think the man ever used a computer. My siblings and I, we got into like all sorts of different sports, and swimming was a big one. And my brothers were better swimmers than I, and they would go to state competitions and so on. And I remember my dad and my mom driving a lot, especially as we got older and became more competitive. A lot of weekends upstate New York, sitting around, swimming pools and so on.
Yeah.
And for me, I was a swimmer, but I was also interested in skiing, and my dad would bring us to ski in upstate New York and out in northern New Jersey. That's how I learned to ski. My dad just bringing us out to Vernon Valley. They were definitely involved. I'm the youngest of 4, and we're 4 right in a row. So 1 year apart.
Oh, wow.
So 4 kids in private school, it was a lot of my parents made a lot of sacrifices.
Yeah.
both in terms of like time and savings and so on to keep it going.
So it sounds like you understand your dad's business quite well. Did you learn that?
I worked on it a little bit.
You worked on it. Okay.
Yeah.
Did you learn it mostly when you worked with him, or just by observing him as a kid, or asking him later as an adult?
I don't know. And I might be oversimplifying, kind of what happened in that business. There might be more nuanced, things that happened in that business. I was, somewhat familiar with it because I worked in it. And so my observations have the benefit of being distant from it in time and experience. I don't think I was making those observations in the moment that I was there.
Sure.
I was just trying to get through the day.
So speaking of that, when you were there working, was he your boss?
No, my brother was generally,
Okay.
or there'd be some other manager who was my boss. My dad was sort of like around, but when you worked for my dad, you were working like on the trucks, like loading boxes onto trucks.
Okay.
More like backbreaking work,
Oh.
and not really any kind of like nice sort of office work.
Got it.
No time on the phone. No, that's what I mean by like trying to get through the day. You're like, wow, this is a heavy box. Like, how am I gonna get it? And what you had to do is you had to figure out, you used to have to label these boxes and figure out like, okay, this is going to California, that's going to Chicago, that's going to Texas, and so on, right?
Got it.
And you had to carefully label each one, and then you had this airway billing label that you'd have to stuff into, and you couldn't mess it up. Losing freight is very expensive. Having done that job, I've had a couple of like more than a couple of manual labor jobs, but it was probably the hardest job that I would ever do, because my dad would have me go work for the company when I got out of college or out of high school. It would be late May, early June. I'd work for a couple of weeks before I got my, job lifeguarding or some cushier job,
Right.
being a waiter or something, And doing that job made me appreciate like how important it is to like get an education, right? And also appreciate like how hard some people work. I remember like there was one time my brother needed me to help him, and I knew the routes and I kind of knew how to do the job, and he needed me to help, and so I took a week off from my desk job, which was kind of just a cubicle job working at a bank, and I took a week off and I helped him out. And I remember getting back to my job, and I was just so grateful for air conditioning.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds funny, but it's true. Like, it's like my hands aren't ripped to shreds. I'm not like just covered in like dust and dirt. I have air conditioning. I can get up and I can go and just get lunch and eat like in a civilized way. I'm not like eating in a truck. It opened my eyes to, wow, I really do have it good. Even no matter how much you dislike your job, somebody's got a worse job than you do.
So how's that translated into how you raise your daughters?
It's hard for me to instill in them kind of what I was raised with, because I think that they have very busy schedules, and so they're legitimately tired at the end of the day. So for me to ask them like to help me with like chores and stuff, it's asking them a lot, because they've had no downtime throughout the day. They're not laying around watching TV. They're not just sort of goofing off in the yard or something like that. They're really busy. Their school day. I mean, my daughter gets on the bus. She's 7. She gets on the bus at 7 a.m. every day. Doesn't get home until 4. It's way different than the way I grew up. And so I don't want to make the same demands on her, because I understand how demanding her life is already, in a way that mine just wasn't at her age.
And so do you in any way still do a lot of the things that you could maybe outsource?
Yeah. So for example, we have a part-time nanny, right? We could have a full-time nanny who could drop my kids off at school, make their lunch, make their breakfast. My wife and I make our daughters lunch and breakfast every day, and I really enjoy it. In the morning, I kind of like that morning. We were talking about morning rituals and coffee and so on. I kind of like that morning ritual of, here's what my daughter likes, here's what they don't like, kind of putting together what they're going to bring in with them to school. And my daughter wears a uniform to school every day, which is actually very interesting. They wear what's called a pinafore. And where she goes to school in the lower school, the tradition, I'm told, the tradition of having this pinafore, which is actually kind of complicated, it has to slip through, like it ties around the back, it's got buttons, and it's complicated because they want to teach the children that they need somebody else to help them get ready for the day. And so you've got these buttons and these strings in the back that you tie, and she needs help getting dressed every day. She can't just pull on a t-shirt and sweatpants and go. She has to stand there, and we have to, zip things, tie things, button things around the back. And it's all because to teach the child to become more dependent on somebody. And so my wife and I, do that every day. Kind of a subtle, but I think important, message to the child that you're going to need help. I think uniforms are just great in general because A, it makes it easier to get ready in the morning. B, nobody really stands out at school, right? You're part of a community and you kind of stand out by what you say, what you do, how you behave, as opposed to how you look.
So you mentioned that your parents split when you were 15.
Yes.
Was that a pretty big moment in your life?
It wasn't. I mean, I look back on it, I think it had a bigger impact on me than I appreciated at the time, which is kind of a weird, maybe surprising, because you might say, well, when it happens, it's this traumatic event, but it didn't feel traumatic at the time. I didn't realize until later, what a big impact it had on our family. I didn't appreciate how deep, the kind of the wounds were, and how long it took to heal that, not just for me, but for everybody, especially my parents.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the time, I was kind of okay,
people break up, that kind of
thing. Yeah, no, it was, and I kind of just, I was so focused on my own life. When you're 15, you're getting that independence, and you're trying to be more responsible, and you're we talked about this a little bit earlier, you got nobody to worry about but yourself. That's kind of emerging, that's kind of your emerging persona, right? And that's where I was. And so for me, it was kind of okay, as long as, I know where I need to be every day. I know, I've got to be at school. Here are my friends. I've got these meets. As long as somebody's paying my bills, I'm good. But yeah, I didn't appreciate until later, how hard that there were big gaps were forming in my development, and probably my siblings' development as well. It probably affected my maturation process, probably significantly.
Yeah.
And I didn't really appreciate that until later.
When did you realize it? Was there a particular moment or type of thing that kept reoccurring?
I probably didn't realize it until I had kids. I probably didn't fully appreciate it until I had kids, because you realize the concept of the family life that we have, falling apart. I can only imagine what that would be like for my kids. And even if they didn't admit it, I'd be this is an important foundational aspect of your life, probably the most important aspect of your life. And for that to fall apart would definitely have damage. I didn't realize I didn't fully appreciate how important that foundation is until I had kids of my own. Kind of when it happened to me, I was already at that phase where I'm just this independent guy, right? And I'm kind of looking out for myself, and I didn't really appreciate how dependent we actually are. And I as I got older, I had some sense of that. I talked to my parents all the time, long into my adulthood, all the way through, until my dad passed away. I was speaking to him regularly. And, I would go to him for advice and so there was definitely that support system there, but it's not the same. And the holidays are harder, right? You have to split time, and you have to be very careful about what you say to each parent about the other parent. And, there's a delicate balance there.
I'm familiar. My parents got divorced when I was 8, 9 years old.
Yeah.
So I definitely can relate to a lot of things you're saying.
Yeah. And so it'd be interesting to know what it's like, when you're 8 or 9. It's probably a lot different because you haven't hit that sort of independent.
It is a big deal. It definitely, you're so young, you still have this, even though my parents were fighting all the time. So in a way it shouldn't have surprised me, but at the same time, I'm so young. they were still the markers of what is ideal in life. They were on a pedestal. They were perfect, even though they were clearly not perfect. To me, they were perfect. So that shattered.
Right.
That illusion shattered when my mom sat me down on the bed and said, hey,
here's
we're
what's
getting
happening.
a divorce. And so it was like, oh man, this thing that I believed in shattered. And it was immediately devastating, very, very memorable. And it forced me to grow up really, really quickly. So, and I did a lot of mediating at a way too young age. And so that also forced me to grow up really, really quickly. So that was my experience. I hadn't yet, being 8, 9 years old, I wasn't developing the independence of a 15-year-old yet. So I was still ultimately dependent, but I had to be able to stand way more on my own, stand up to my parents sometimes, because they would be jerks. They'd be jerks to each other. They'd be jerks to us just because they're stressed and they're going through a traumatic thing. And now that I'm the same age that they were approximately when they were going through that, I know that, just because you're 40-something, 50-something, whatever age, you're never perfect. I thought they were perfect at the time, right? I thought they were perfect. And now I'm like, okay, you were, not only do I now know nobody's perfect, but you were in a very, very stressful situation. You were even further from perfect. So that was my experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. Yeah, I think if I was I think it would have affected me the same way if I were your age when it happened, right? That it would have forced me to grow up faster. For me, I kind of took it in stride. It's funny the way the mind works, right?
Do you remember when you were told and how?
I do. Yeah, I do. I remember all of it. And we went out to dinner, and my parents told us, and it, like you, they were fighting a lot, so it wasn't like a big shock to me. And it was not quite, I wouldn't say it was relief, but it was like a pause here probably makes some sense. I was old enough to appreciate like that it couldn't go on the way it was going on. Something had to change. And, look, I wish it had changed, that they, worked it out. But it didn't. And I just remember you're so confident as a teenager, and you're just like, I got this. I can take care of this as long as like these bases are covered, right? Like I didn't have to go out and like find a place to live, right? As long I just go to school, do my thing. I got my friends. I was a year away from getting a learner's permit, and so on. So I was like, kind of, and like living in the city, I could take the subway or the bus or and it kind of made it easier for me to escape my house. Yeah. Because I would say, I'm just staying at so-and-so's house or this, and like, okay, fine, that's fine, Not that they would have always said yes to that, but it would just like, it just sort of accelerated my kind of like moving away from my house.
Yeah. And so did you kind of push it to the periphery in the back of your mind
just sort of,
for a long time?
Yeah, exactly. You just sort of like put it away. You're like, this happens, and you just compartmentalize it and you move on, and you don't sort of address, or you kind of just go and you continue to grow up and mature, but without maybe developing in the optimal way. Yeah. You do need your parents and their help, and to not rely on them so much is probably not a healthy thing. I think I was always like pretty independent, but it made me pretty independent, probably in an unhealthy way.
And I guess that probably is, in some way, you could draw some circuitous roots between those observations and how you guys help your daughter get dressed in the morning and the uniform.
Exactly.
Teaching.
Yeah, and just becoming like you need people. And cocky is the wrong word. I think you develop blind spots, how to deal with people, how to work with a team, how to communicate with people. All those things like need to come. I think that's an important thing that you develop kind of in your teens. And when your parents are going through that, I don't think that fully develops. It just doesn't.
Yeah, you are already in the mode of I'm a teenager, I'm a guy, so there's this innate desire to be very independent,
and you're kind of cocky, right?
You're cocky.
Yeah.
You want to spread your wings. You want to flex your muscles.
But you also need to have, like, I think if you have, both your parents, like, at home every day, they're going to be, like, calling you out, right? And be like, hey, wait a minute, like, hey, big shot, like, I noticed that you didn't complete this assignment at school, or like, hey, big shot, like, why I thought I asked you to take the trash out, why isn't that done, right? Like, I think you kind of need that, or like, hey, why didn't you do this, or why did you talk to that person that way? That was, you could handle that differently. I that kind of, like, guidance, I wasn't, like, looking for that kind of guidance, even though I needed it.
Right. I mean, very typical for a teenager to rebel against that, and you didn't even have it to rebel against in a way. It wasn't there.
It's kind of like not there. Yeah. I mean, I had rules, but it was not that hard to kind of ignore them.
Yeah. So this idea of an appreciation for being dependent and the importance of being dependent on others, do you feel like that's a value that courses through your family, you and your kids?
Yeah, I've had to become better at it. Just become more, just better listener. Be able to, like, depend on people. Relying on other people to take care of things, and not, like, sort of micromanaging it, and the way you communicate with, like, other people that you work with or in your life, all that. It took me a long time to get better at that. I'm still getting better at it.
Yeah. So was your kind of timeline of kind of personal growth, very you focused until? Yeah,
I mean, I would say too much, and a little bit. Yeah, I would say that's true. Yeah, I mean, I don't think. There's a podcaster, Jocko Willink, I think his name is. Have you ever heard of Jocko Willink?
Mm-mm.
He's like a special forces guy who does leadership training for executives, and a very interesting guy. I've listened to a few of his podcasts, not many, but I remember one in particular. He was like, he's like, I think there were 3 times in my life that I really felt like I was a man. The day I joined the Army, the day I got married, and the day I had a kid. Like that, those 3 steps were his steps towards becoming, like, a man, right? And for me, like, I never joined the military, so forget that step. But, like, I got a job, let's say, right? Got my own apartment and so on. So let's just call that, like, that's the first step. But those other 2 steps didn't come from me, like, much, much later in life. And I think we can talk. This is actually a segue to, like, what it's like to be an older dad. It was a long time, and you do kind of live in this world where you kind of float along. You're a mature adult, mature male, but you're not a man in the sense of, you're not tied into the community in the same way. I've got so many friends now that I would never have if I didn't have kids, and they're of a different generation, which I find to be really, really interesting. I find it, like, fascinating, like what they, how, the sort of cultural differences between, the generations, and, I'm woven into this, like, social fabric now in a way that I just wasn't before.
So if we were to go back in time to, let's say, 2010, what was your social circle like?
Oh, it was great. No, it was fun, and fun is, what's the best way to put it? There's some satisfaction you get from having fun, but there's no meaning you get from having fun, right? And so I always had something to look forward to, and, vacations to go on, and parties to go to, and rounds of golf that I could play. I can play golf anytime. Pretty much, if it doesn't interfere with work. My weekends are my own, right? My afternoons, or after work is my own. I can work out whenever I want. I can do whatever I want. It's fun, right? I can watch whatever movie I want. I can call up friends who are maybe in the same position I am. Like, hey, let's go and have dinner, whatever. It's great. And in New York City, right? I mean, the possibilities for fun are infinite, right? Even if it's just playing, like, Scrabble at somebody's house, right, or going to a club or something, there's this panoply of entertainment. And so I enjoyed it. And I had good friends that I developed in that time. But you're not building that kind of meaningful engagement with your community that you have by having a family. It's just, I can't imagine that as a single guy that I would have nearly the community that I have where we live. It's just, I don't think it would be possible.
Did you feel it when you were single? Like, this is fun, but empty? Yeah. You could feel it.
I could, yeah, for sure. I wouldn't say empty quite, but just that this is not sustainable. This is great, but like, I can't be doing this forever. At some point, I need to take those one or two more steps. I mean, some people can't have kids, but you have to take at least one more of those steps, and that's going to sort of build you up. And like, getting married and having kids, any gaps you had in your maturation process, they're going to get filled in pretty quick, right? Because it gets you it gets you focused on and attentive and responsible for somebody beside very, very fast, right? Like, you just get slammed in the face with a 2x4, the day your first child is born.
Right. Yeah, it didn't exactly get the warm up.
There's no warm up. Yeah. And you're constantly, the only time you get to sleep is when they sleep.
Right. Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And so I think it just made me, it just become like less selfish. And I don't want to quite say it's selfish, but you're not making any sacrifices for anything, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're not making any sacrifices for anything, you're probably not building anything meaningful. We talked a little bit about how you go through this protracted period of your life where you're not married, right? And you don't have kids. And I got a lot done professionally. I got a lot done as far as travel. And I saw like every part of the world I visited practically. And so it was very enjoyable. And there was some meaningfulness to it. But I really appreciate that I've got a whole set of friends from college and from high school who are my age. And then I've got this whole other set of friends who are 20 years younger in some cases, right? And it's kind of neat to have like a good set of friends in a younger generation. My parents, the way I grew up and the way most people in my community grew up, I would say almost everybody in my community grew up where, your parents made a living, they paid for your school or your sports or whatever, and you paid for a car, and nobody was taking lavish vacations or anything like that, and we had like nice homes, but nobody lived in a big fancy house. Nobody had like big fancy cars or anything like that. My point is people kind of lived like, paycheck to paycheck, maybe a little bit of savings, it was like people were modest income generally, right? And people had big families. So it was like hard to make ends meet, and people did. But as you're older and you're more affluent generally, right? You're farther along in your career. You've got all this free time, that I wouldn't have. I've got the ability to take a Friday afternoon off. If I was 30, I couldn't do that, right? I've got way more flexibility with my time. I've got a way more flexibility with, money because I've saved so much money over the course of my life. And so that changes things a lot. I think that it's a positive and a negative because if the kids say, listen, I want to take a ski lesson, I can afford that in a way that my parents probably couldn't.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in my community couldn't. And that's great. But it's kind of nice to have limits where it's like, hey, you know what? That's not in the budget and that's not happening. We can't afford that. So you're going to have to go to the park and play with your friends or something like that. I don't want my kids to just think that like every luxury is available to them. Like my kids have probably been out to dinner more times in their lifetimes than I was before I was 25.
Right. Yeah.
They've been on planes. They fly around, and like I flew once before I took my second flight of my life when I was 14 years old. It's like only my second time on a plane. Yeah. And the first time I didn't even remember, right? And like then the world's changed. But I think as an older person with more savings, the limitations of like travel and going out to dinner and taking lessons and stuff, there aren't, it's less limited. I guess it's a long way of saying I fear that I'm spoiling my kids.
Yeah. No, I think that I can definitely relate to that concern. And so you're somebody who, from what you've shared, you've grew up very much middle class in an era where, and in a neighborhood, in a community that, like you said, more paycheck to paycheck, something close.
And we had some luxuries, but it was limited.
And now you're an older dad who's got an established career, a lot more savings than somebody who's becoming dad in their 30s. And you also have a perspective on money. In a way, your career is very closely related as somebody who manages money, manages investments. So with all of that, you've got a very wide-ranging perspective on this important topic of money. And how do you funnel all of that perspective and wisdom down into your kids?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, again, like my kids, even though they have a lot, they have a lot in terms of my time, and they've got our savings at their disposal. They also are very busy, and they work hard at, being on time and being attentive in class. And so if they ask for something like, a ballet lesson, I don't want to just say no to them, because I feel like they're putting in the work.
Yeah, right.
And I want to give them a reward. But at the same time, I don't want them to feel like, hey, this is just world's your oyster. I want them to work and sacrifice and suffer, for lack of a better word. Suffer meaning just like, hey, go get a job where like people are yelling at you.
Yeah.
Right? Or, when they get older, I'm going to demand that they, we'll see how this goes. But
tough guy talking right now.
But, the idea that they're just going to sort of sit around the house, I mean, forget it. You got to go get a job. As far as like what they pursue in the rest of their lives, I want them to be happy and have like, a rewarding career, but you got to work hard. If you're not working hard, things just go off the rails.
Yeah.
We're built to work hard.
As far as those two topics, work and money, how have those two topics evolved in your own personal life through your period as a single guy to now where you are as a married father of two? What did work and money mean to you when you were on your own, and what do work and money mean to you now? So
I struck gold with my career in terms of the people I work with. It's been rewarding financially. But at somebody I met by struck gold. I've been in the same place for 20 years, and I love it. I work with a great group of people, and I get to determine when I come and go generally. I determine, I manage a portfolio, on my own terms generally. And I've got a lot of freedom. Now, you do go through periods where you work, like where you're doing a lot of modeling and you're doing a lot of reading and research. But once the investment's in the fund, it's in the fund, and you're just waiting for it to play out. I remember when I first started doing it, some of my colleagues would say, like, you're going to have to find your sea legs with this job. And you do. You can't work your way out of problems sometimes.
Right. Talk about dependence on others.
Or if there's like a crisis, you can't, let's say that you have a stock that goes down 20%, right? And maybe it's going to go down another 20%. You don't know. And you've already built your model, you've already done your analysis, you've already so you make a decision. Do you want to keep owning it? Do you want to buy more, right? Do you want to sell it, right? And it's never clear. If you made the right decision on the front end, then you should be more confident in buying more.
It's an opportunity, actually.
Right. It's almost like in bridge, like the bidding process is 70% of the game. And so to consider like the research about in the underwriting process that goes into like a new idea, that's 70% of the lift.
Yeah.
Okay. Everything else, like if you did that right, if you got that right, then you've done most of the work. And so you should feel more confident if you did a good job on the front end. You should feel more confident buying it later if it goes down a lot.
Do you bring that perspective to parenting in any way? Are we on the front end in a way? Are we in that 70%?
Yeah, no, it's true. Like, and that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Like, in other words, if I can start to develop like healthy habits about like, hard work around the house, like, hey, look, you got to do these dishes. You got to put those dishes in the sink. Let's stay focused on this. And, why didn't you do that thing I asked you to do? And why aren't you listening? And so on. I think it's really important to do that now.
Yeah.
and not try to make up for that later.
Yeah.
The difference between kids and stocks is you can't sell kids.
I guess when it's down 20%, you are buying more. You are absolutely buying more.
Yeah, I mean it's
you don't have to worry about that decision.
Yeah, I own it. But no, but that lesson of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? And so if you're careful, I think in these earlier years, building up, your kids' work ethic, building up your kids' sense of responsibility, building up your kids' attitude towards others, I think that pays back big time. We do a lot of family skiing, and my daughter, who's 7, just did like a downhill race through Gates with my wife, against my wife. She was on the ski team, and the ski team had this last day of the season. They said, listen, parents can race their kids. My wife's a good skier. And my wife's on the ski lift saying, like, oh, I think I'm just going to let Louise win this, I'm like, I don't know if you're going to need to let her win. And Louise beat my wife by 2 gates, which is a lot, right? What I'm saying is they've learned that at a young age, that to get to that point later in life is so much harder. It's so much harder. And so it is with, I think, ethics, be it work ethic, be it respect for others, be it becoming a good listener, becoming like an empathetic person, all those things. The sooner you work on them, the better, because remediating it later is going to be at least twice as hard. How you interact with your kids changes so much. Small kids, small problems, right? Bigger kids, big problems. And, I'm kind of waiting for, the sort of, middle school and teenage eye rolls and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get a little bit already.
Yeah.
I don't know
how you think you'll handle it.
I don't know. I'm going to have to just cross that bridge when I come to it. I don't know if there's any way to prep for it, because I think you just get blindsided. Yeah. I had like a little taste of this recently, where my younger daughter has just become like obsessed with like nail polish. I'm like, what are you doing with nail polish?
Right.
And both the girls are like, they see other girls who are like makeup and earrings, and they're asking about these things. I'm like, no. That comes like way later. But I may not I may not contend with these things on my terms and in my time frame. It's probably going to sneak up on me in like very unexpected ways.
Right. So speaking of on your own terms and preparing for it, was becoming a dad on your own terms? Yeah,
it was. And it was I think my wife, knew that I was ready for it. And I kind of knew that I was ready for it. And like I said earlier, it's a young man's game, and I had kids later in life, but even in your mid-40s, you start to feel like, things are starting to like break down here. I need the energy for this, and so I was aware of that, even before I had kids, that like I got to get on this, if I want to do this.
Happen.
Yeah, and so it was the right time, the right person, and I was ready for it. Yeah.
How old were you when your first was born?
She was born in December of 2017, so I would have been 48. Yeah.
Did you think of yourself as an older dad?
I started, yes, for sure, because I've got friends who are grandparents now. There's one guy from my, he put this up on Instagram that he became, he's at his grandchild's christening, and I was like, oh, to like stop following you, and I know others who are grandparents who are like not that far, not much older than me, and like that's just normal. Like, my grandfather was a grandfather at my age.
Do you ever wish or imagine what it would have been like to become a dad earlier?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. But I don't think I would change really, other than those kind of like fantasies about just what it'd be like to be an empty nester now and have like all that freedom. And no, I kind of like it the way it kind of shook out the right way. I do worry about, being older, you become, are you going to die sooner in your life than your kids? If my expected life is 80, I've got 5 more years on Earth, right? And that's going to cheat my kids maybe out of what I had in my life where my parents were there. It's a great gift to have your parents throughout your life.
Yeah.
And if that gets truncated because of my life expectancy, that will cost them something.
Right. Does that motivate you to
be healthier?
Be healthier, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it does. It
Okay.
does. Yeah, no, it really does.
How's your dad bod? How are you doing health-wise?
Not bad. Not bad. I need to work on it. Like I said earlier, I play squash. I've been trying to do more protein-based diets, and so I eat a lot of steak. And, I try to avoid sugar. I drink a lot less than I did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I just try to keep moving. I try to walk a lot, and I try to go to Pilates classes and so on. But I can feel the atrophy of my body for sure. And so you think a lot about it. I think having kids makes you think about mortality, right? Because you think about how incredible life is, that it can happen, how delicate it is, especially at an early age. And you think about, your own mortality more as you lose parents and as you realize you're so much older than your kids. And so you say, well, what's the rest of my life going to look like? Am I going to spend my time, how am I going to spend the rest of my time? Am I going to spend my time focused on me? Right? And what does that get you? Or are you going to live in the city of man or the city of God?
That's a very interesting distinction. Is that something for you that you draw that from a place in particular, sort of city of man or city of God?
Yeah, I mean we're I think you start to realize, when you make sacrifices for your family, are there more sacrifices you can make to live? If you meet your maker, what are you going to say that you did to make the world better than? But at some point, what we do in this world doesn't matter as much as it doesn't matter if it's just for us.
Yeah.
It matters more what you do for others, what sacrifices you make.
When did you come to this place? I imagine that if I met you in 2010, before you'd met your wife, when did this John appear?
I don't know. I think I felt it my whole life. Not my whole life, my whole adult life. I felt like there was something kind of missing. As you become a father and you become more responsible for others, you want to raise others properly, but you also, I think, start to reflect on who you are. It's almost like you become a father to your kids and a parent to yourself. My project was not finished. There were more areas that I could work on in my own life. So it's hard to tell your kid, hey, you're not being fair, or oh, you should share more, if I'm not doing that at the same level or higher in my own life. It's kind of like you have to set an example. It's not even so much setting an example, because it's not even the things that they see. It's just I don't want to be a hypocrite. So when I'm away from my kids, am I behaving the way that I would expect them to behave? Again, it goes back to, we talked about being more tied into your community. Am I being the best member of the community I can be? Is my family behaving well? Are my kids behaving well? Am I behaving well to my community?
You've mentioned community throughout our conversation, so I can tell that it's something that you really appreciate and that you really value in this moment in life. And another thing you mentioned also that reminds me of that word community. You distinguished city of man and city of God. And so city of God and community are phrases that pertain to your contemporary experience.
Yeah, and in a community, ideally, your community becomes more like the city of God than the city of man, right? The city of man is building subways and building businesses and office towers and industry and, the sort of day-to-day competition amongst ourselves, right? The city of God is something where it's not so much about your personal success is measured not in what you accrue for yourself, but what you give back to your community. And I think a well-functioning community has both, right? You can't have everybody just sacrificing themselves for the good of the community. That doesn't work because, you need to put food on the table and so forth, right? But there is a balance of finding ways to just be more selfless, giving your time, giving your money, speaking truth. Are you representing yourself in the most honest way to your fellow people in your neighborhood, in your family? Are you showing who you truly are to them? Or are you trying to be something you're not? I think those are very important things. And you learn that. You're always learning that, perhaps. And I think you do a reassessment of yourself when you have kids.
Yeah. So everything you're saying, this is John the dad. This was not John, the single guy.
I wouldn't say that it was not. I would say that when you're a single guy, especially living in a place like New York, you get on a treadmill. You can be a good person. It's not like I was totally selfish. When you're just sort of having fun and you can hurt people. You cannot be the best friend or the best.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like you just put everything on pause.
Yeah.
And it's easy to kind of fall away from, a higher calling. And the higher calling is what we talk, being selfless, sacrificing, building something meaningful.
You mentioned a lot of things like work ethic and responsibility, understanding the value of money. But what you just said to me sounds more like, at the end of the day, if there's a singular overarching lesson that you're trying to pass on to your girls, it would be closer to that.
Yeah. If my girls listen to this in 20 years, I would say, just be honest.
Okay, dad number 15 of the Dad Bod is in the books. Big thanks to John for sharing his story. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it brought a little something positive to your day. Hit that subscribe button and post up a 5-star review in your favorite podcast app. But most of all, share the Dad Bod with people in your life that you care about. Thanks again for listening.